She was called ugly in a room full of diamonds. She stood there alone, scarred, silent, while 500 people laughed. Then the most dangerous man in the city crossed that ballroom floor, took her trembling hand and said it loud enough for every predator to hear, "You are looking at the most beautiful woman alive." They stopped laughing, every single one of them. And that was only the beginning of what Mafia Boss would make them regret. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. What happens next will change the way you think about beauty, power, and revenge forever. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, slipped under Mira's bedroom door without a knock, without a word, the envelope so crisp and white it looked like something that didn't belong in her life. She'd held it for a long time before opening it. The Varin Family Charitable Gala, Aurelio's Hotel Grand Ballroom, black tie, 8 o'clock. And at the bottom, in her stepfather's handwriting so precise it looked machine-printed, "We expect you present, not a request, not even close." Mira had set the invitation on her desk and stared at it until the words blurred. Then she'd folded it back into the envelope and put it in her dresser drawer and gone to sleep, because that was what she'd learned to do inside the Varin house. Don't react. Don't give them the reaction they're fishing for. Close your eyes. Get through the night. Wake up and do it again. She'd been doing that for 11 years. She was 26 now. She'd moved into the Varin house at 15, the year her mother married Edmund Varin and brought her along like an afterthought. Edmund had a daughter already, Celeste, 14, blonde, already beautiful in the way that turned heads and parted crowds. Mira had a scar on her left cheek from a car accident when she was 9, a smile that pulled slightly higher on one side due to nerve damage, and a quiet so deep it sometimes felt like she'd swallowed something heavy and never got it back out. Celeste had noticed the scar on the first day. She hadn't said anything. She'd just looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Mira's eyes and smiled in a way that had nothing warm in it at all. That had been the beginning. The night of the gala, Mira stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom and looked at herself for exactly 30 seconds. She was wearing a gray dress. Not silver, not charcoal. Gray. Plain, clean, long enough to be appropriate. Her dark hair was pulled back. She'd put on lipstick because she thought it might help, then wiped half of it off because she didn't want to look like she was trying. The scar caught the light the way it always did. A pale crescent from just below her cheekbone down toward her jaw. She'd had people tell her it wasn't that noticeable. She'd always thought that was a kind thing to say, and completely untrue. She picked up her small black clutch and walked downstairs. Celeste was in the foyer. She was wearing a dress the color of champagne, backless, with a neckline that required architectural confidence. Her hair was down, gold, and perfect. She had 3 inches of height on Mira even without the heels. When she turned and saw Mira on the stairs, something moved across her face. Amusement, calculation, and something that might have been relief, the way a predator relaxes when it realizes the prey isn't going to run. "That's what you're wearing," Celeste said. Not a question. "It's a gala, not a runway." Celeste tilted her head. "For some people, it's the same thing." She smiled. "Come on, the car's waiting." Edmund Varin was already outside by the black car, his phone to his ear, his gray suit pressed to the point of severity. He was a handsome man in the way that expensive, controlled things are handsome. Square jaw, silver temples, eyes the color of old money. He glanced at Mira when she stepped out, registered her, and looked back at his phone without saying a word. That was Edmund. He'd never been cruel to Mira directly. He'd been something harder to name. Indifferent in a way that had weight to it. A deliberate turning away, like she was furniture he'd inherited and never quite figured out where to put. The drive to the Aurelios took 40 minutes. Celeste talked the entire way. About people who would be there, about donations, about a deal her father was finalizing with some consortium she named and then immediately explained was very important, as if Mira might not otherwise understand. Mira watched the city pass outside the window. The light smeared against the glass when it started to rain, and she thought about the drawer in her desk at the accounting firm where she worked. The one with the sticky note she'd written herself 9 months ago that said simply, "Find a way out." She hadn't found it yet. The Aurelio's Hotel was the kind of building that had been designed to make people feel small. Obsidian marble facade, columns that rose 4 stories, a canopied entrance where valets moved in choreographed silence. The lobby inside was all black stone and gold fixtures, and the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than Mira's monthly rent. The ballroom was at the end of a long corridor lined with mirrors, and Mira caught her own reflection in 6 of them as she walked. Gray dress, pale scar, slight asymmetrical smile she was keeping deliberately still. The room was already full. 500 people, maybe more. The women were in gowns, red, ivory, emerald, cobalt, and the men were in suits that fit the way money fits, precisely, without effort. The air smelled of champagne and cologne and something underneath both, something that Mira had always thought was the specific scent of rooms where people compete. Crystal chandeliers threw light in every direction. A string quartet played near the far wall. Waiters circulated with trays so quietly they seemed to materialize and disappear. Edmund was absorbed immediately, a cluster of men in dark suits converging on him near the entrance with handshakes and the careful laughter of business. Celeste was already moving, already working the room, kissing cheeks, touching arms, turning her smile on and off like a faucet with perfect pressure control. Mira stood near the entrance for a moment, then moved along the edge of the ballroom toward one of the high tables, picked up a glass of water she didn't particularly want, and held it. She knew how to do this. She'd been doing it her whole life inside the Varan orbit, becoming part of the architecture. Still enough that people's eyes slid past her, present enough that Edmund couldn't say she hadn't shown. She watched the room. She watched the way the clusters formed and reformed, the way alliances were being made and quietly tested, the way certain men stood with a particular stillness that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with power. She noticed him before she understood why. He was standing near the bar on the far side of the room, and he wasn't doing anything remarkable. He was just standing there, holding a glass of something dark, watching the room the way Mira had been watching it. But where Mira watched from the edges out of self-preservation, this man watched from the center of his own gravity. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, wearing a black suit that didn't have a single unnecessary thing about it. His face was angular, hard-planed, with dark eyes set beneath brows that carried some permanent calculation. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing. He simply existed in that room at a different frequency than everyone else. She didn't know his name yet. She would, very shortly. She looked away because looking at powerful men in rooms like this was something she'd learned not to do. It was 20 minutes later that Celeste found her. Celeste moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed the room was hers by inheritance, which, in most of the rooms she'd ever been in, it effectively had been. She had 2 of her friends with her, Petra Lund and Sophie Crane, both beautiful, both sharp in the way that women get when they've spent years watching someone else wield beauty as a weapon and have decided to wield their own. They flanked Celeste like decorative blades. "There you are," Celeste said, arriving at Mira's table with the energy of someone who had been looking for her specifically, which meant she hadn't been looking for her at all and had simply spotted her and pivoted. Standing against the wall, as usual. "I'm standing at a table," Mira said. "Same difference." Celeste's eyes moved over the gray dress in a way that was slow enough to be deliberate. "That dress is very sensible," Petra laughed. Sophie looked at her glass. "Thank you," Mira said, because sometimes the only way to take the blade out of a compliment was to accept the surface of it and leave the rest on the floor. Celeste's smile sharpened slightly. She'd never liked that. The not reacting. It took away the satisfaction of the strike, and Celeste had always liked the satisfaction. "I'm serious," Celeste said, louder now, and Mira could tell by the slight projection in her voice that this was no longer a private conversation. A woman at the next table glanced over. A man with silver hair half turned. "I think it's nice that you came, really, even with everything." A pause. "It must be difficult, showing up to things like this." "Things like what?" Mira asked, even though she knew exactly where this was going and should have walked away, would have walked away if she hadn't been tired, had been wearing different shoes, had slept more than 4 hours the night before. "Galas. Events." Celeste tilted her head, all sympathy, all performance. "Where people look at you." There it was. Mira felt the old familiar compression in her chest, the thing that lived behind her sternum and tightened whenever the world reminded her that she was different, that the scar was visible, that the smile was uneven, that she existed in rooms like this as an exception to be noted and catalogued rather than a person to be spoken with. She felt it tighten, and she breathed through it, and she kept her face still. "I manage," she said. "I'm sure you do." Celeste reached out and touched Mira's arm, and the touch was gentle. But there was something in the gentleness that was worse than cruelty. It was pity performed for an audience, and the audience was growing. 6 people within earshot now. 8. "I've always admired how you just don't let it bother you. The way people look at you, the scar, and the—" She gestured vaguely at her own face, and Mira understood the gesture, the asymmetrical smile, all of it. "You just show up anyway. It's brave, honestly." "Celeste," Mira said quietly. "I mean it." And now Celeste's voice was carrying across at least a quarter of the ballroom, because she'd always had excellent projection when she wanted it. Most people couldn't do it. Stand here in this room, knowing how they look, knowing what people are thinking. You must have incredible internal strength, or maybe you just stopped caring what anyone thinks. She smiled. "Either way, I think it's remarkable." Laughter then. Not from everyone, but from enough. It started the way that particular kind of laughter always starts. Tentatively. A single person allowing themselves the reaction, and then the permission spreading. Not the bright laughter of something genuinely funny, but the low, sideways laughter of cruelty being acknowledged and shared. The kind that said, "We're all thinking it, and she's just saying it." A woman in a red gown turned away, still smiling. A man Mira didn't recognize said something to the man next to him, and they both looked at her without looking at her. Petra laughed with her hand over her mouth, which was somehow worse than open laughter. Sophie had moved a step away, and Mira noticed that, the way you notice exits. Celeste was watching her with that smile that had nothing warm in it, waiting. Mira set down her glass. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in front of Celeste Varon in 11 years, and she was not going to start in a ballroom full of strangers in a gray dress with champagne flutes and string quartets, and the particular specific humiliation of having your face discussed like a flaw on a form to be documented. She was not going to cry, and she was not going to leave, and she was not going to give Celeste the satisfaction of either. But she didn't know what to do with her hands. She was standing there, fingers slightly curled, the laughter still moving in low ripples through the nearby clusters of people. And she was thinking about the drawer in her desk at work with the sticky note that said, "Find a way out." And she was thinking that she was so tired of this, of the Varon house and Edmund's deliberate blindness and Celeste's surgical precision and rooms full of people who laughed at the wrong things. And she was thinking all of this and keeping her face completely still when the laughter stopped. Not gradually, abruptly, like a sound cut off at the source. Mira looked up. He was crossing the ballroom toward her. The man from the bar. The tall one in the black suit with the dark eyes and the face that looked like it had been built for difficult decisions. He was walking directly toward her, not looking at Celeste, not looking at the crowd, not performing anything. The crowd was parting for him, not because they'd been asked to, but because something in the way he moved communicated a specific and non-negotiable physics, the kind that says, "I am the thing other things move around." People stepped aside without seeming to decide to. Conversations faltered. The woman in the red gown who'd laughed turned and suddenly found something very interesting to study in the middle distance. He stopped in front of Mira. Up close, he was even more precisely what she'd sensed from across the room. The stillness, the density of presence, the eyes that registered everything without broadcasting anything. There was a scar on his jaw, she noticed, thinner than hers, older. His expression was not warm and was not cold. It was something else, something that looked like it had burned through warm and cold a long time ago and come out the other side as simply, permanently direct. He looked at her, not at the scar, at her. Then he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were still slightly curled, and she didn't uncurl them fast enough, and his hand closed around hers before she'd fully processed what was happening. His grip was dry, firm, without performance. He was not asking permission. He was also, she would think about this later, not taking it from her. It was something different, something she didn't have a word for in the moment. He simply took her hand as if it were a natural thing to do, as if he'd been crossing the room with this specific intention for the last several minutes, which, she would later learn, he had. He turned to the room. Not the whole room, just enough of it. Just the people in the immediate radius, the ones who'd laughed, The ones who'd turned away, Celeste standing with her champagne and her frozen smile, and her two friends who were now very studiously not making eye contact with anyone. His voice carried without being raised. That was the thing about it. It didn't need volume. It had the quality of something that fills a room by existing rather than by being amplified. "You are looking," he said, "at the most beautiful woman alive." Silence. Not polite silence. Not the silence of a room that's heard something unexpected and is working out how to respond. The silence of absolute social arrest, the kind that happens when the most dangerous variable in any given environment suddenly reorients itself, and everyone within range understands, on some primal level, that the rules have changed. Celeste made a sound, half a syllable, killed by the look he turned on her. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply the specific silence of a man who does not grant the thing you're about to say the legitimacy of his attention. She closed her mouth. He looked back at Mira. His expression had shifted, only slightly, only in the eyes, something that might, in a different face, have been gentleness. But in his face was something more like recognition, like he'd seen something, confirmed something, decided something. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, a single, deliberate motion. Then he said, quieter, meant for her, "I'm Roman Kael, and I'd like you to walk with me." Mira looked at him for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Her hand was still in his. The room was still silent. Celeste was still standing 5 feet away with champagne going warm in her hand and an expression that Mira had never seen on her face before. She would identify it later, turning it over in her memory, and the word she'd settle on was rattled. "I don't know you," Mira said. "No," he said. "That's why I'm introducing myself." She looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face. She thought about 11 years of becoming invisible inside the Varon house, and the sticky note in her desk drawer, and the way Celeste's voice had carried across the ballroom like she owned it, and the laughter that had moved through the room like something contagious and mean. She said, "Okay." They walked. The crowd gave way. Not from politeness this time either. There was something different in the parting, something with more deference in it, the specific deference of people who recognize a name and understand what it means. She could feel the shift as she walked beside him, the way the room's weight redistributed, the whispers starting as a current behind them. She heard his name 3 times before they reached the far corridor. Roman Kael. She knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name the way they knew the name of a storm system. Not because they'd experienced it directly, but because its edges touched everything. He ran operations no one discussed openly. He controlled logistics networks across 3 ports. He sat on the boards of companies that were, on paper, entirely legitimate. And the paper was immaculate. And the men who'd tried to look behind the paper had a way of becoming occupied with other things. He was not, by any legal definition, a criminal. He was also not, by any honest definition, simply a businessman. He was exactly the kind of man you did not walk beside through the corridors of the Aurelio's Hotel. Mira walked beside him anyway. They went through a side door off the main corridor and into a smaller room. A private lounge, low lighting, a bar that nobody was staffing at this hour, 2 leather chairs angled toward a window that looked out over the city lights going rain-blurred in the dark. He released her hand and moved to the bar, poured 2 glasses of water, brought them back. She noticed the water. Not alcohol. She noticed he'd noticed she'd been drinking water all evening. She sat down because her legs were asking her to. He sat across from her and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the ballroom, directly, without the survey of her face that she'd spent 26 years cataloging in strangers, the involuntary flick to the scar, the recalibration, the decision about whether to mention it or to perform not noticing it. He didn't do any of that. He just looked at her like a person. "That woman," he said. "She's your sister. Stepsister." He turned his glass slowly. "She does that often." It wasn't a question, but Mira answered it anyway. "Often enough." "And your father?" "Stepfather." "He was in the room." "He was in the room," she confirmed. Roman looked at her for a moment. "Did he hear it?" She thought about Edmund at the entrance with his phone and his cluster of suits and his deliberate practiced blindness. "He hears everything he chooses to hear." Roman nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He picked up his glass and drank from it and set it down and said, I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer it honestly, even if you think the honest answer sounds strange. All right. Do you know what your name is attached to? Mira went still. What do you mean? Your full name, Mira Voss. He watched her face. Do you know the companies it's registered to? Her chest did something that wasn't quite tightening and wasn't quite dropping. It was more like the specific sensation of a floor shifting, the moment before you understand that what felt solid isn't. I work in accounting, she said slowly. I don't have equity in anything. I haven't signed. You have, he said. You did. Or someone signed for you. Either way, your name appears as a director of record on 4 shell companies registered through 3 different jurisdictions over the last 18 months. He paused. 2 of those companies were used to move money that you do not want your name associated with. The room seemed to contract slightly. The rain-blurred lights outside went softer, then sharper. That's not possible, she said. But even as she said it, she was thinking about the stack of forms Edmund had handed her 8 months ago. The ones for what he'd described as the estate's holding structure, something about consolidated family finances. And she'd skimmed them the way you skim things when you've been trained not to ask too many questions, and she'd signed where he'd indicated. And she'd thought nothing more of it because she never thought more of things inside the Varon house if she could help it. It's documented, Roman said. I've seen the filings. Why have you seen the filings? He looked at her. The expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A decision being made, she thought, about how much of the truth to give her and in what order. Because I've been watching Edmund Varon for 14 months, he said. Because he has positioned himself as a partner to someone I'm in conflict with, and I make it my business to understand every part of the structure around the people I'm in conflict with. A pause. And because 3 weeks ago, I came across your name in a document that told me you were being set up to take the fall when this thing collapses. The room contracted further, or maybe it was her. She thought about the invitation slipped under her door. We expect you present. She thought about Celeste's performance in the ballroom, the audience, the cruelty, the very public declaration of Mira's unworthiness. She thought about Edmund's phone call in the car, the careful distance of a man keeping his hands clean, keeping his attention elsewhere. She thought about the forms she'd signed in a stack on a Tuesday in Edmund's study while he stood by the window and didn't look at her. They were going to sacrifice me, she said. It didn't come out like a question, and it didn't come out like a revelation. It came out flat and quiet, the way things come out when you've already suspected them and are now simply naming them out loud. Roman said, yes. She looked at the water glass in her hand. She hadn't taken a drink from it. She'd been holding it the whole time. She set it down on the table between them and watched her own hand, the slight tremor that she was holding at the base of her fingers through sheer will. The thing behind her sternum was not the old familiar compression now. It was something different. It was older, deeper, and it had a temperature, not cold, not hot, but something that burned without light. How long have you known, she asked, that it was you specifically? 6 days. And you came tonight because you were going to be here. He was still watching her with that direct, undemonstrative attention, and I needed to see you. To tell me this. To tell you this, he said, and to see what kind of person you were before I told you. She looked up at him. And? He picked up his glass again. There was something in the set of his jaw that wasn't quite the ghost of something. It was the actual thing, she thought, just lived in a face that didn't display it fully. The kind, he said, who keeps her hands still when someone tries to take them apart in public. The kind who doesn't run. He set the glass down. I can work with that. She should have asked what that meant. She should have asked 100 things. What he wanted from her, why it mattered to him. Who he was beyond the name and the reputation and the dark eyes that seemed to read the temperature of every room without effort. She should have been afraid. She was sitting across from Roman Kael in a private lounge at the Aurelios Hotel while her stepfather worked a room 30 meters away, building whatever he was building on a foundation of her name and her signature and her 11 years of learning not to ask questions. She wasn't afraid. That was the strange part. She was something she couldn't immediately name, hollowed out, and then refilled with something that had teeth to it, something that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. What happens now? She said. Roman looked at her for a moment. "Now," he said, "you decide whether you want to know how deep this goes." Mira thought about the sticky note in her desk drawer. Find a way out. She thought about Edmund's forms. She thought about Celeste's voice carrying across a ballroom full of people who laughed at the wrong things. She thought about 11 years. "Tell me everything," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, and something moved in his expression. Not surprise, not satisfaction, something quieter than either of those. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and laid a single folded document on the table between them. She leaned forward and picked it up. Her name was at the top of the first page. She read for 3 minutes without speaking. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the rain kept falling, blurring the lights of a city that, she was beginning to understand, had been doing things in her name for over a year. When she looked up, Roman was watching her. "There are 4 more pages," he said. She turned the page. She was still reading when, at the far end of the Aurelios Hotel, in the obsidian marble ballroom where 500 people were drinking champagne and conducting the careful business of power, Edmund Varon received a text message. He read it. His expression did not change. He put his phone in his pocket, excused himself from the conversation, and walked to the corner of the ballroom where Celeste was standing with her champagne and her rattled smile. He leaned close and said something very quietly. Celeste's smile disappeared entirely. She turned and looked toward the corridor that led to the private lounges, and her face, for the first time in the 11 years Mira had known her, looked something that was very close to afraid. Back in the lounge, Mira turned the last page. She read the final paragraph. She set the document on the table. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at Roman Kael, and the thing in her chest that had a temperature, that thing that burned without light, grew very clear and very still. "All right," she said. Roman looked at her. "All right? I want to see all of it," she said. "Everything you have. Every company, every filing, every signature they put on my name." She heard her own voice, and it was not the voice she'd used in the ballroom, the careful, measured, flat voice of a woman keeping herself together. This was something else. Something without the compression in it, without the weight. "And then I want to know exactly how to take it apart." Roman studied her for a moment. Outside the window, the rain fell. The city lights blurred and steadied and blurred again. "That," he said, "is going to take longer than one night." "I know," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. Something in his face moved. That deep, almost visible thing, the one that lived behind the stillness. He reached into his jacket again and placed a second document on the table. A transfer authorization, his cliffside estate, guest arrangements, his signature at the bottom. "Then we start tonight," he said. Mira looked at the document. She looked at the rain on the window. She looked at the man across from her, the most feared name in the city, the dark eyes, the scar on his jaw, the suit without a single unnecessary thing about it. She thought about everything she was leaving in that ballroom. She thought about what she was walking toward. She picked up the document. She didn't know yet that Celeste, at this exact moment, was pulling out her own phone in the corner of the obsidian marble ballroom. She didn't know who Celeste was calling, or what she was offering, or what the name on the other end of that call would mean. Not yet. Not tonight. She only knew that for the first time in 11 years, the thing in her chest felt like something other than weight. She folded the document and put it in her clutch. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." The car that took them from the Aurelios was not the kind of car people flagged down. It was already waiting at the side entrance when they came through, a black vehicle with tinted glass and a driver who didn't turn around, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge either of them beyond a single nod in the rearview mirror that Roman returned with nothing more than a look. Mira got in. The door closed. The city began to move past the windows. She sat with the clutch in her lap and the folded document inside it, and her hands flat on her thighs. And she thought about the fact that she had just left a gala in the middle of the evening with a man whose name made rooms go quiet, and that somewhere in that ballroom Edmund Varon was watching his phone and Celeste Varon was already making calls, and that none of the things she'd thought were true about her life 45 minutes ago were still true now. The rain was heavier. The streets reflected it upward, light on wet asphalt, the city looking like its own mirror image, distorted and flickering. Roman sat beside her and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. He was looking out his window, not ignoring her. She could feel that he was aware of her, aware of the slight tension in the way she was holding herself, the breathing she was keeping deliberately even. He was simply not filling silence because he didn't feel the need to. She found that, unexpectedly, steadying. "You said you've been watching Edmund for 14 months, she said finally. "Yes, before he connected with whoever you're in conflict with. Before and after. Then you knew about the shell companies before you knew about me." He turned from the window. "Yes, and you didn't—" She stopped, recalibrated. The question she wanted to ask was, "Why didn't you warn me sooner?" But that wasn't the right question, because the answer was obvious. She hadn't been the objective. She'd been a detail in a larger structure, and details didn't get warnings. "How long has my name been on those filings?" "The earliest registration is 19 months ago." 19 months. She did the math. That was 3 months before she'd signed Edmund's stack of forms, which meant they'd built the structure first, put her name on the first layer without her knowledge, and then handed her the second layer to sign herself, to add her own fingerprints. Thorough. She had to give Edmund that. He was very, very thorough. "He used older forms," she said, "the ones I signed. They looked like estate consolidation documents. They were drafted to look that way. And a lawyer signed off on them." "A lawyer Edmund has been paying a retainer to for 11 years, Roman said. "His name is also in the filings. He'll be a secondary target for the federal inquiry." Federal inquiry. She let that sit for a moment. "There's already an investigation." "There will be. The question is when it breaks, and who it breaks on first." He turned back to the window. "Right now the structure points to you. You're the named director with the cleanest paper trail and the fewest obvious connections to the money itself. When investigators look at this and the way investigators look at these things, you are what they find first." She felt her jaw tighten, not with fear, something harder. "Because Edmund made sure I'd be what they find first." "Yes. And Celeste?" Roman was quiet for a moment. "Celeste's name is not in any of the filings." Of course it wasn't. The car climbed. She realized after a few minutes that they'd left the city proper and were moving up into the elevated neighborhoods at the city's northern edge, the ones that clung to the ridge of hills above the port, where the houses were far apart, and the roads were narrow, and at night, all you could see were the lights below and the dark water beyond them. The rain had thinned to a mist. The road curved and climbed, and the lights of the ballroom and the Aurelios and the Varine house were somewhere far behind and below. And she thought about how strange it was that distance could be measured in minutes when what you were leaving took years to build. The estate appeared around a final curve. Stone gates, a gravel drive, a house that was large without being ostentatious, set back from the cliff's edge with the city spread out below it like something under glass. Roman came around and opened her door before the driver had fully stopped, which surprised her because it was such an ordinary gesture in a night full of nothing ordinary. Inside, a woman was waiting. 50s, compact, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing dark clothing with the kind of practicality that said she'd been awake since before the gala and would be awake long after it. She looked at Mira with an assessment that was fast and professional and not unkind. "This is Vera," Roman said. "She runs the house." "Ms. Voss," Vera said. Not a question. She already knew the name. "There's a room prepared?" Roman asked. "Second floor, end of the East Hall." He looked at Mira. "You don't have to stay. I can arrange transport to wherever you want to go." Mira thought about the Varon house, her bedroom, the form she'd signed on a Tuesday, Edmund's careful distance, the drawer with the sticky note. "I'll stay," she said. Vera led her upstairs. The room was clean and spare. A bed, a window seat, a small desk, a bathroom with towels folded with the precision of someone who took care in small things. Vera set a glass of water on the desk and a fresh set of clothes folded on the bed's edge. And when Mira looked at the clothes, not her size exactly, but close, Vera said simply, "Roman keeps basics for guests. First drawer has anything else you might need," and left without ceremony, which Mira appreciated more than she could have explained. She sat on the edge of the bed and took the document out of her clutch and read it again. All 5 pages, this time without the shock of seeing her name at the top. She read it with the careful attention she brought to ledger reconciliations at work, the same methodical line-by-line parsing, and what she found was meticulous. 4 shell companies, 3 jurisdictions, 19 months of filings. Her name as director of record, her address, her professional credentials listed, the accounting background specifically, which she now understood was the point. A director with an accounting background who controlled shell companies that moved dirty money was not an unfortunate victim. She was the perfect architect. That was what Edmund had built her to look like. She folded the document again. She set it on the desk. She looked at the rain on the window and the dark water far below and the lights of the city that had been operating without her knowledge on her name for a year and a half, and she thought, I am so tired of being used. She slept for 4 hours. It was the deepest sleep she'd had in months. In the morning, Roman was already in the study when she came down. A room off the main corridor, walls lined with filing systems, and 2 large monitors and a work table covered in documents organized with the precision of someone who understood that information was the actual currency of power. He was in a different suit, dark coffee and 2 cups on the table, which told her Vera had informed him she was awake, or he'd heard her, or both. He slid a folder across the table without preamble. The financial structure in full, all 4 companies, source documents, incorporation filings, transaction records. She sat down and opened it. What followed was 3 hours of the most focused work she'd done in years. Roman talked, and she listened and asked questions, and the questions she asked told him things about her that she wasn't aware she was broadcasting, that she understood complex financial structures instinctively, that she could track shell company layering across jurisdictions with a speed that most people with her background couldn't, that her mind moved in a specific way when it was working on something real. He watched her work with the same attention he'd given her in the ballroom, and she was too deep in the documents to notice. By noon, she had mapped the full structure on paper. By 1, she had identified 3 discrepancies in the transaction records that even Roman's people hadn't caught. Anomalies in the timing of fund movements that suggested a 4th party in the structure. Someone beyond Edmund and his lawyer, someone whose name appeared nowhere in the filings, but whose fingerprints were in the numbers if you knew how to read them. She tapped the page. There's someone else. Roman looked at the page. He was very still for a moment. Then, show me. She walked him through it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, and the quality of that quiet was different from his usual silence. It had something in it, some recalibration happening behind the dark eyes. His name is Dario Sen, Roman said. She didn't know the name. He runs distribution networks across the southern corridor. He's been trying to acquire 2 of my port contracts for 3 years. Roman's voice was flat, but there was something moving underneath the flatness, something controlled and cold. If he's in this structure, then Edmund isn't just your business adversary's contact, Mira said. He's actively building something with him. Against me, Roman said. Yes. She looked at the documents. She looked at her own name at the top of every 3rd page. And I'm in the middle of it. You were put in the middle of it. There's a difference. There is, he said. He looked at her directly. That's why you're here and not under indictment. The days that followed had a structure she hadn't expected. Roman was not a man who wasted time, and he did not treat her like a guest who needed managing or a victim who needed protecting. He treated her like someone with a specific set of capabilities that were relevant to a specific problem, and he worked with her accordingly. In the mornings, they went through documents. In the afternoons, he brought in other people. A lawyer named Cassius, who spoke in precise, economical sentences and had the careful eyes of someone who had navigated very complicated situations for a very long time. A woman named Rael, who ran financial forensics and who treated Mira with the sharp collegiality of one professional recognizing another. And occasionally a man named Pike, who said very little, whose function Mira didn't ask about, and Roman didn't explain. She learned things. She learned that the shell company structure was a liability vehicle, designed not to move money indefinitely, but to hold it long enough for the collapse to be attributed and the real architects to exit clean. She learned that Edmund had been in financial trouble for longer than anyone in his circle knew, that the Varon family's visible wealth was built on a structural deficit that had been accumulating for 8 years. She learned that Celeste, who had spent her entire life performing certainty, had been performing it against a backdrop that was quietly, methodically dissolving. She learned in the evenings other things. Roman had her working with Riel on the forensic analysis, which was legitimate and necessary. But he also started doing something else. He started talking to her. Not about the case, not about the structure, about other things. He'd come into the study after dinner, when she was still working, and pour 2 glasses of something that was never alcohol before midnight. And he'd sit in the chair across from her and sometimes start talking and sometimes just read while she worked, and the silence was a different kind of silence than she was used to. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of someone present. She learned that he'd grown up in a city that wasn't this one, that he'd had a brother who died young, that the scar on his jaw was not from violence, but from a car door in a parking lot when he was 22, that he found most social performance exhausting, and that he'd been at the gala that night not for the charity, but because Edmund Varon had been on the guest list, and Roman liked to watch people he was building a case against in natural environments. She learned that he'd noticed her before Celeste's performance, before the laughter. She didn't ask why. He didn't explain. But she thought about it afterward in the room at the end of the East Hall, lying in the dark with the city lights below the window. And she thought that it was strange and specific, and she didn't know what to do with it. He noticed her noticing. On the 8th day, he said, without looking up from the document he was reading, "You're trying to figure out what I want from you." She didn't deny it. "Aren't I right to?" He looked up. "You are." A pause. "I wanted your help with the financial analysis. That's still true." "And beyond that?" He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the most honest answer she'd gotten from anyone in longer than she could measure. And it landed differently because of that. Not reassuring, not unsettling, just true. "That's not very safe," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." She thought about safe. She thought about 11 years of safe, of quiet and compression, and keeping her face still in rooms that laughed at her. "All right," she said, and went back to the documents, and he went back to his, and the silence between them shifted again into something she still didn't have a precise word for. She was 3 weeks in when the first call came. She'd kept her phone off for the first 5 days, then turned it on to check her work email, and found 47 messages and 17 voicemails, the majority from Edmund. She hadn't listened to any of them. But on the 22nd day, her phone rang with a number she recognized, the direct line from her desk at the accounting firm. And she answered it before she thought it through. It was her supervisor, a careful man named Whitford who'd always treated her fairly and now sounded like he was reading from a script someone else had written. She was being placed on administrative leave, he said, pending review. He was sorry. It wasn't his decision. "What kind of review?" she asked. He paused for a long beat. "Regulatory," he said. She stood in the East Hall with her phone in her hand after the call ended, and the thing in her chest that burned without light got very hot and very bright for a moment, and then she breathed through it, and she went back to the study and sat down and said, "They've made the first move." Roman looked up. "I've been put on administrative leave, regulatory review." She set her phone on the table. "They're using my employment to establish a paper trail. If I'm flagged by a regulator at my firm, it creates an employment record tied to financial irregularities. That goes into the public record. When the federal investigation launches, you're already half credible as the architect," Roman finished. "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his own phone and made a call and said 3 sentences to whoever answered and hung up. "Cassius will file a counter-registration before the end of business tomorrow," he said. "It won't stop the leave, but it'll create a parallel record showing you contested the characterization." She nodded. She was still looking at her phone. "Mira." She looked up. His expression was not soft. It was never quite soft. But it had that quality again, the one she'd seen in the ballroom, the recognition. "This is going to get harder before the documents are ready," he said. "They're going to keep tightening the perimeter, your employment, your accounts, potentially your name in the press. I know. I need to know you're staying with it." She looked at him for a moment, thought about Celeste's voice in the ballroom, thought about her name at the top of 5 pages, thought about 19 months of her identity being used as a disposal mechanism by people who'd taken her in and called it family. "I'm staying," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. 2 days later, Roman found her in the East Wing at 6 in the morning, sitting on the window seat in the reading room with her knees up and the city below still dark and the first pale light just starting over the water. She'd been up since 4. He sat in the chair across the window without asking if she wanted company and without bringing anything except himself, and he said, "Tell me about before. The Varin house." She looked at the window for a moment. "Why?" "Because I want to understand the full picture." She thought about not answering. Then she thought about all the things she'd never said out loud, because there'd never been anyone who asked like they wanted the real version, and not the version that would make everyone comfortable. She started talking. She didn't look at him while she did it. She talked about the first day in the Varin house, the way Edmund had looked at her and then looked away permanently. She talked about Celeste's first smile with nothing warm in it. She talked about the scar and the smile and the way she'd spent years learning the architecture of invisibility, how to move through rooms without taking up space, how to answer questions without saying things, how to be present without being present. She talked about the accounting firm, how she'd gotten the job herself, built the skill herself, because nobody in the Varin house had facilitated anything for her, and she'd needed something that was entirely hers. She talked about the sticky note in the desk drawer. She talked about the 11 years. She stopped. The city below was turning gray and gold. Roman was quiet for a long time. Then, they saw the accounting background. "What?" "Edmund. When he built the structure, he saw your professional background and he used it." The flatness in his voice had a particular quality now, not anger, something colder. "That's why you specifically. Not just because you were available and had no power. Because your skills made you the perfect frame." She hadn't thought about it that way. She'd understood it intellectually from the documents, but hearing it spoken like that the one thing that was entirely hers, the thing she'd built because she needed something real, had been the specific reason she'd been chosen, did something to her chest that was different from the old familiar compression. It was more like something breaking cleanly, the kind of break that hurts immediately and clearly. "How do I use that against them?" she said. His chin lifted slightly. He looked at her with an expression that had moved past recognition into something else, something she thought might be respect in its most stripped-down form, the kind with nothing performed about it. "That," he said, "is the right question." They were 4 weeks in when Vera came to the study door at 11 at night with the expression of someone delivering a message they'd been specifically instructed not to soften. She looked at Roman. "Call for you," she said. "It's Pike." Roman was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. Mira watched him leave, watched the particular way he moved when something was wrong, faster, tighter, the stillness replaced by something operational. She waited. She heard the call from the corridor, not the words but the tone, short, clipped, the rhythm of information being processed and acted on simultaneously. He came back. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. "What happened?" she said. "Celeste made contact with Dario Sen," he said. 2 nights ago. In person." Mira went still. "She gave him something," he said. "We don't have the full contents yet, but based on what Pike intercepted, it included routing information." He paused. "For my port operations." Silence. "She also—" He stopped. The hand on the doorframe pressed harder. "She gave him a name for my internal structure, someone who has access to my security systems." Mira's voice was very quiet. "A traitor inside your organization, or someone who became one tonight." He came into the room and stood at the table and looked at the documents spread between them, all those weeks of careful mapping, and his jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. If Sen has the routing information and an inside contact, he has everything he needs to hit us. She looked at him. "How long do we have?" "Before he moves?" Roman calculated. "A week, maybe less." She looked at the documents. She looked at the months of work. She looked at her own name at the top of every 3rd page, her name that had been used to build a trap for her and a weapon against Roman, her name that had been written on forms she'd signed on a Tuesday while Edmund stood by the window and didn't look at her. Something shifted. It had been shifting for weeks. She could see that now, the incremental accumulation of it, the mornings in the study and the evenings in the reading room and the 3 hours mapping financial structures and the conversation on the window seat at 6 in the morning and the question, "How do I use that against them?" and the look on his face when she asked it. It had been shifting like tectonic things shift, slowly and entirely, and now something had broken through the surface. She stood up. "I need to go back," she said. Roman looked at her. "To the Varin house. To my father's private files." She corrected herself before he could. "My stepfather's. He keeps physical records. He always has. He doesn't trust digital for the real documentation, which is why he uses lawyers and paper trails instead of servers. The actual ledgers. The real ones. Not the filing copies." She looked at Roman. "If they're going to move in a week, I need to be ahead of it. I need the originals." "Mira, I know the house," she said. "I know every room. I know Edmund's schedule. I know the study layout. I know where he keeps the things he doesn't want found, because I've been invisible in those walls for 11 years, and invisible people see everything." She paused. "If I can get the original ledgers, we don't need to wait for the federal investigation to find its way to me. We can hand them the case ready-made." Roman looked at her for a long time. The dark eyes moved over her face. Not the scar, not the asymmetrical smile. Just her, the whole of what she'd become in 4 weeks, and what she'd been before that. "If Edmund sees you," he said, "he won't. If Celeste is there, she usually isn't on Thursday nights. Mira." His voice was not soft, but it had something in it, a weight, a specific resistance, the kind that comes not from strategy but from something harder to name. "If this goes wrong, it won't," she said. And then, because she owed him the truth the way he'd given her the truth from the beginning, "And if it does, I need it to have been my choice." She looked at him steadily. "That's important to me, that this is mine." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment that the room held very still around them, and the city below the window was dark, and the documents were spread between them, and the week they had left before everything moved was already counting down in the background. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she said. "I'll have Pike on the perimeter." "All right. You go in, you get what's there, and you come out." His voice was flat and absolute. "You don't stop for anything else." "I understand." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned back to the table and picked up the phone, and she watched his profile, the jaw, the scar, the particular quality of his stillness when he was working through something difficult. She thought about the man who'd crossed a ballroom to take her hand when the room was laughing. She thought about what that had cost him in terms of exposure and calculation and the specific economics of power. She thought about the document he'd laid on the table, the transfer authorization, guest arrangements, his signature, which had been, she understood now, its own kind of declaration, not of beauty, but of something more durable. She was not the same person who had stood against the wall in a gray dress and held a water glass with slightly curled fingers while a room laughed. She did not know yet what she was instead. She would find out Thursday. Thursday came the way difficult things always come, quietly, without ceremony, the morning arriving gray and ordinary while everything underneath it was anything but. Mira was dressed before 6. Dark clothing, flat shoes, her hair pulled back with nothing on her face. She stood at the window in the East Hall room and looked at the city below and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way she'd been doing since the estate, since Roman had started showing her how to enter rooms and read them before the room read her. 4 weeks of mornings, 4 weeks of learning that the body has its own intelligence if you stop overriding it with fear. She wasn't afraid. That was the thing she kept turning over. She should have been afraid. She was walking back into the house that had spent 11 years carefully, systematically erasing her, to steal documents from a man who had built a federal liability structure around her name and was currently, presumably, watching that structure tighten and preparing to exit clean when it collapsed. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something taut and clear, like a wire pulled to exactly the right tension. Not comfortable, not relaxed, but precise. Roman came to the doorway at 6:15. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And neither of them said the things that were available to be said. "Pike is already positioned," he said. "North side of the Varin property. He has a clean line on the driveway and the east garden entrance." "I'll use the east garden," she said. "There's a door off the kitchen corridor that Edmund's staff uses. The lock is a basic pin tumbler, the kind with the worn third pin. It doesn't catch cleanly unless you pull the door while you turn." She'd noticed it 2 years ago and never said anything. Invisible people notice everything. Roman crossed to the table and picked up a small device. Flat, the size of a matchbook, matte black. Document scanner. Riel calibrated it this morning. Hold it over a page, press the top face. It stores the image. It can hold 400 pages before it needs to clear. She took it and put it in her jacket pocket. Edmund's study is on the second floor, east corner. He keeps the physical records in a standing cabinet behind the desk. Mahogany, brass handles. The key is on his personal ring, but he leaves a spare in the center desk drawer because he's been locking himself out since I was 17 and he never learned. She paused. The real ledgers will be in the bottom section of the cabinet. He calls them the archive files. I've seen them twice. Once when he left the cabinet open by accident, and once when I brought him coffee he didn't ask for, and he didn't hear me on the stairs. But Roman studied her. How long do you need? 20 minutes for the study, 10 for anything else. You have 30 total, he said. Edmund has a dinner at the Callaway Club on Thursdays. He leaves at 7:15 and returns no earlier than 10:30. Celeste has been at her friend Petra's on Thursday evenings for the last 3 weeks. He paused. But that pattern is based on surveillance that is now 6 days old. You're telling me Celeste might be there. I'm telling you the information has an expiration. She nodded. She understood the weight of what he wasn't saying, which was that Celeste had met with Dario Sen 2 nights ago, and a woman who had just made contact with your enemy and handed over routing information was a woman who was operating on a specific timeline, and specific timelines changed behavior. I'll clear the ground floor before I go upstairs, Mira said. If you see Celeste, I come out. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were at his sides, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was working through the full calculation of a risk and arriving at a number he didn't entirely like. She'd learned to read that expression over 4 weeks, and she read it now and said, Roman. He looked at her. I'll come out, she said. I promise you. He nodded. Then, because he was who he was, and she'd come to understand what that meant, not the name, not the reputation, but the actual man underneath both, the one who'd crossed a ballroom and laid a document on a table and poured 2 glasses of water and asked her, tell me about before. He reached out and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Not a grip, not a warning, just a presence. There and then gone. 30 minutes, he said. 30 minutes, she said. She went. The Varon house was in the northern residential district, 8 minutes by car from the estate's lower gate. Pike drove her in a vehicle she didn't recognize and dropped her 2 blocks south without speaking. She walked the rest. The neighborhood was old money and high hedges and the specific silence of streets that believe they are above the noise of the city below. The rain from earlier in the week had left the sidewalks dark and the air smelling of wet stone. She moved along the east wall of the Varon property and found the garden door in the wall where she'd known it would be and went through. The east garden at dusk. She'd sat here once, years ago, on the stone bench near the dormant fountain, and Celeste had come out and stood above her and said something so precisely calibrated to wound that Mira had stopped sitting in the garden after that. She moved through it now without looking at the bench. The kitchen corridor door. She tried the handle first, locked, as expected. She pulled the door toward her with her left hand while turning the handle with her right, and the lock gave the way a worn lock gives, with a kind of mechanical sigh. She was inside. The house smelled the same. Lemon polish and old wood and something faintly floral from the arrangements Edmund's housekeeper replaced every Monday. It was a smell she'd spent 11 years breathing without choosing to, a smell her body associated with compression and silence, and keeping her face still. She stood in the kitchen corridor for exactly 5 seconds, listening. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that is either empty or very carefully maintained. She moved. Ground floor first. She went room to room the way Roman had shown her. Doorframe, pause, read, enter. The drawing room, the dining room, Edmund's informal sitting room off the library. All empty. The housekeeper's quarters were in the western wing, and she could hear, very faintly, a television through the wall. She accounted for that and kept moving. The staircase. She knew which steps to avoid, the 3rd and the 7th, which creaked regardless of where on the tread you stepped. She went up the left side of the 4th and the right side of the 6th and arrived at the 2nd floor landing without sound. The hallway. Edmund's study at the end. The door was closed. She stood outside it and listened and heard nothing and turned the handle. The study was dark. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She crossed to the desk and opened the top center drawer and found, as she'd expected, the spare cabinet key on a plain ring between a letter opener and a box of paper clips. She took it to the standing cabinet behind the desk. Mahogany, brass handles. She put the key in the bottom lock and turned it. The archive files were there. 4 accordion folders, thick with paper, labeled in Edmund's precise machine print handwriting. She lifted the first one and opened it on the desk, and took the scanner from her pocket and started working. Page by page, the device humming so softly it was barely audible, the pages feeding through. She was fast, faster than she'd expected, faster than she'd practiced, because something in her body had understood that this was the moment all the compression had been accumulating toward and was cooperating fully. She was 12 minutes in when she found it. It was in the third folder, a separate section held together with a binder clip, the paper slightly different in weight and texture from the rest. She almost moved past it. She caught the difference in her fingers before she caught it consciously, that slight variation in paper stock, and she stopped. She read the top page. It took her 3 seconds to understand what she was looking at. Then she stood very still for a moment that stretched out in a way that had nothing to do with clock time. It was not a ledger page, it was a contract. 4 pages. Legal format, dated 14 months ago. She knew the date. That was when Roman had told her he'd started watching Edmund. The contract was between Edmund Varen's primary holding company and a second entity she didn't immediately recognize, for a consulting arrangement and an information-sharing agreement. She read the second entity's name again. Then she read it a third time. Kael Strategic Holdings, LLC, Roman Kael's company. She didn't move. She didn't breathe for a moment. The scanner was still in her hand. The third accordion folder was open on the desk. The house was quiet around her and the night was outside the window and her heart was doing something she could feel in her throat. She read the contract. All 4 pages. She read every line of it. It took her 8 minutes and she was aware, on some distant level, that she was eating into her 30-minute window, but she couldn't stop. Because what she was reading was rewriting everything she thought she knew about the last 4 weeks in a way that felt like the floor shifting, except worse, except permanent. The contract established a 3-year consulting arrangement between Edmund's holding company and Roman's. The scope of services was described in language deliberately general. Strategic analysis, market positioning, risk assessment. But the financial terms were specific. Quarterly payments. Substantial ones. In a particular clause in the 4th section, the one that had made her stop breathing, a clause about information rights. Each party agreed to provide the other with advance notice of any regulatory or investigative actions affecting shared business interests. Shared business interests. She turned to the 5th page, which wasn't part of the contract but had been clipped to it. A summary sheet, Edmund's handwriting, notes. She read them. She found her own name halfway down the page. Mafia Boss. Director placement confirmed. RK advised on structure. Shell company registration per agreed parameters. Exit timeline, 18 to 24 months post-placement. RK advised on structure. She put the papers down on the desk. She stepped back. She was aware of the way her hands were moving, slightly. Not a tremor exactly, more like a vibration, the body registering something before the mind has fully processed it. She was aware of the window, the dark outside it, the city below the hill, the estate with its study and its 2 coffee cups and its weeks of documents mapped between them. RK advised on structure. Roman Kael had known about the shell companies before she did because Roman Kael had helped design them. She put the scanner on the desk. She picked up the summary sheet. She looked at it again, not because she hoped she'd misread it, but because she was the kind of person who needed to look at a fact directly when a fact was this terrible, needed to let it be exactly what it was without flinching away from it. Her name. Her placement. Exit timeline 18 to 24 months. She was the exit strategy. She'd always been the exit strategy, and Roman had known. The question that followed that one, the question she couldn't stop herself from asking even now, even standing in Edmund's study with her hands vibrating and the 30-minute window running down, was, then why the ballroom? Why the document on the table, the transfer authorization, the weeks of work, the window seat at 6 in the morning? Tell me about before. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know if there was one that held. She scanned the contract and the summary sheet. Her hands steadied because she told them to. She put everything back in the folder, back in the cabinet, locked it, returned the key to the center drawer. She picked up the scanner and put it in her pocket. She was operating on a track below feeling now, the one that runs parallel to shock, when shock is too large to process immediately. The track that says move, survive, get out. She was at the study door when she heard the voice downstairs, Celeste, and a second voice she didn't immediately recognize. She stood in the doorway and listened, and the second voice clarified itself, and when it did, her entire body went cold. She knew that voice. Not personally, she'd heard it twice, both times on recordings Roman had played for her in the study at the estate, when he'd been explaining who Dario Sen was and why he mattered. A distinctive voice, slightly accented, with a particular rhythm of speech that sat between courtesy and threat. Dario Sen was in the Zverin house. On a Thursday evening, 6 days after Celeste had made contact with him, he was here, which meant the pattern Roman had been tracking, Celeste at Petra's on Thursday evenings, had been cover, a blind, something set up to give the surveillance a false read while the real meetings happened somewhere else. She didn't move. The voices were in the drawing room directly below. She could hear the shape of the conversation without the full content, Celeste's high, precise diction, Sen's rhythm, back and forth, something being confirmed, something being agreed to. Then she heard a third voice. Edmund Varin, who was supposed to be at the Callaway Club until 10:30, who had left at 7:15 according to Roman's surveillance, who was standing in his own drawing room on a Thursday night while Mira stood above him in his study with scanned copies of a contract that linked Roman Kael to the architecture of her own destruction. She pulled the study door closed behind her without sound. She went back down the hallway, avoiding the 3rd and 7th steps, moving in the specific way Roman had shown her, the way that kept the body quiet when the mind was screaming. She reached the kitchen corridor. She reached the east garden door. She went through it and across the garden and through the wall door and out onto the street. She was 1 block away when her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pike. You're late. Come out now. She was already moving. She got in the car and Pike pulled into the street without waiting, and she sat in the back seat with the scanner in her fist and the city passing the windows, and her mind running the contract language on a loop. RK advised on structure, exit timeline, 18 to 24 months post-placement. And underneath that loop, quieter and colder, the question she now needed to answer before she did anything else. Who was Roman Kael to her, really? And what happened now that she knew? Pike drove. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. The city moved past the windows, all lights and rain-wet streets, and somewhere on a hill above the Port Roman was in his study with his coffee and his documents and the precise, undemonstrative attention of a man who had looked at her like a person from the beginning, or had known from the beginning exactly what she was for. The car turned up toward the hill. The estate gates appeared in the headlights. She looked at them. She did not tell Pike to stop. She went in. Roman was in the study. He was standing at the work table with his back to the door when she came in, and he turned and looked at her, and his expression moved through its sequence. Relief that she was back, assessment of her state, the beginning of a question, and she crossed the room and put the scanner on the table between them and said, Kael Strategic Holdings. The expression stopped. She watched his face very carefully. She'd spent 4 weeks learning the grammar of it, the way it operated, the things it showed, and the things it held back. She watched it now with the same precision she'd brought to the ledger pages and the financial structures and the transaction anomalies, because she needed to see what was true. Something moved in his face. Not guilt, not calculation. Something she hadn't seen before, something that had the quality of a man who has been carrying a specific weight and has just watched it arrive at the destination he'd been dreading. Sit down, he said. Tell me what page 37 of that contract means, she said. She did not sit down. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved to the chair and sat down himself, and she understood that he was doing it deliberately, taking himself to her level, not standing above her for this. She noticed it, and it did not make her feel better, and she thought he probably knew that. It was 14 months ago, he said. I know when it was. The arrangement was established before I understood what Edmund was planning to do with it. I entered a consulting contract with his holding company because he was positioned in 2 markets I needed access to. It was a business arrangement. It was... He stopped. It became something else. When did it become something else? When I found your name in the filings. She looked at him. 6 days before the gala. Yes. So for 14 months you were in a consulting arrangement with the man who was building a criminal liability structure around my name. And you knew about the structure for 6 days before you walked across a ballroom and told a room full of people I was the most beautiful woman alive. He held her gaze. Yes. The summary sheet, she said. Her voice was very flat, and she was keeping it that way through pure effort. Edmund's handwriting, RK advised on structure. What does that mean? It means I told him the shell company layering he was using was detectable. I told him how to make it less detectable. The words were stated without deflection, without the softening that would have been worse than the truth. I didn't know whose name was going on those companies when I said it. I was advising on the architecture, not the contents. When I found out the contents, you came to the gala. Yes. To do what? Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she hated it and kept going. To fix it? To protect your exposure? Because if I go down for those companies and someone looks at the consulting contract between your holding company and Edmunds, Mira, then the man who advised on the structure goes down with the director of record, which means you needed me out of Edmund's orbit and into yours before the investigation. Mira. His voice was not raised, but it had a quality that stopped her, a specific weight. Look at me. She looked at him. Both of those things are true, he said. My exposure is real. Removing you from Edmund's control protected me. And I came to find you because when I read your name in that document and understood what they were doing with you, something in me... He stopped. The jaw worked slightly. I don't make a habit of this, any of this. The window seat at 6 in the morning is not how I operate. The room was very quiet. She looked at his face. She looked at it the way she'd looked at Edmund's summary sheet, directly, without flinching, letting it be exactly what it was. She thought about 4 weeks. She thought about the water glass, the coffee, the scanner calibrated by Riel that morning. Tell me about before. She thought about his hand on her shoulder. There and then gone. She thought about page 37. I need to know, she said, and her voice was very quiet now, whether anything you've done in the last 4 weeks has been only about protecting your exposure. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. I need more than that. I know, he said. I know you do. He was silent for a moment. I can't give you certainty. I can tell you that the man who advised on a financial structure 14 months ago and the man sitting in this room are not operating from the same place. I can tell you that when I read your name in that document, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time, and it was not calculation. Pause. I can tell you that what I feel when I look at you has no strategic value whatsoever and has been making my life considerably more complicated for 4 weeks. She was silent. I can also tell you, he said, that none of that matters if you don't trust me, and that I understand why you don't. She looked at him for a long time. The city was below the window. The scanner was on the table between them with 400 pages of evidence on it, including the contract, including the summary sheet, including every page she'd gathered from Edmund's archive. The week was counting down. Dario Sen had been in the Varon drawing room tonight, and Edmund had not been at the Callaway Club, and the pattern was broken, which meant the timeline had changed. She reached out and picked up the scanner. Edmund wasn't at dinner tonight, she said. Sen was in the house, both of them, with Celeste. She watched his face process this. Whatever they're planning, it's not in a week. It's sooner. Roman was on his feet immediately. How much did you hear? Not enough. But Sen was there, Roman, in person. That's not a planning meeting. That's a final confirmation. She looked at him. They're moving. He was already across the room, already picking up his phone, already doing the thing he did when everything shifted to operational. The stillness replaced by focused momentum, the face clearing to pure function. He made the call to Pike. She heard the short sentences, the instructions, and she stood in the center of the study with the scanner in her hand and the contract on it and 4 weeks of everything they'd built between them. And she thought about trust and evidence and the specific arithmetic of choosing who to believe when the stakes were this high and the ground was this uncertain. She thought about her name at the top of every 3rd page. She thought about RK advised on structure. She thought about the window seat. She made her decision. Roman hung up and turned to her. "I need to see everything on that scanner," he said, "including whatever stopped you in the house." She held it out. "Page 37, she said. "We're going to talk about it, all of it, and then we're going to figure out how to move before they do." She paused. "But Roman, when this is over, when the evidence is handed over, and the case is closed and my name is clean, you and I are going to have a very different conversation about those 14 months. He took the scanner. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "We are." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and said, "Show me everything Pike has on Sen's movements in the last 48 hours. We're out of time to be careful. We need to be fast." He sat down across from her and opened the scanner, and the night outside the window pressed close, and the city below them was full of things already in motion, and Mira Voss, who had walked back into the house that broke her and come out the other side with evidence and a wound she hadn't expected, looked at the man across from her and understood that she was, finally and completely and with no version of retreat available to her, in it completely. She didn't sleep, neither did Roman. They worked through the night with the scanner between them and Pike's surveillance reports coming in every 40 minutes, and Rael on a live call from her apartment cross-referencing Sen's known movement patterns against the new data. The study had the quality of a room that had stopped pretending it was anything other than a war room. Documents spread in overlapping layers across the work table, 2 laptops open, empty coffee cups pushed to the edge, the overhead light harsh and unrelenting at 2 in the morning. What they built over those hours was a picture, and the picture was worse than either of them had outlined before. Sen wasn't waiting a week. Sen was moving in 48 hours. Pike had intercepted a logistics communication, encrypted, partially decoded, that referenced a port window on Saturday night, which was the window Roman's operations used for the Northern Corridor transfer. Someone inside Roman's structure had given Sen the exact transfer schedule, the route confirmation, and the security rotation. The inside contact wasn't hypothetical anymore. The inside contact had already delivered. Roman sat very still when Riel read out the decoded segment. His hands were flat on the table. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through a calculation that had a human variable in it he didn't want to reach the conclusion of. Mira watched him and said nothing because some things needed the space to land. "Who has access to the rotation schedule?" she said finally. Not a question, a prompt. "4 people," Roman said. His voice was level in the way that required effort. "Pike, Vera, Cassius, and Marco." She'd met Marco once, a compact, quiet man who ran Roman's port operations with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for 15 years and believed in nothing except the work. She'd thought, when she met him, that he had the eyes of a man who'd made his peace with the life he was in. "Marco," Roman said, quietly. Riel said nothing on the other end of the call. Roman picked up his phone and set it down again. Picked it up again. Made the call. Marco answered on the second ring. Roman said 3 sentences. There was a silence on the other end that went on long enough to be its own answer. Then Marco said something Mira couldn't hear, and Roman closed his eyes for a moment. Not long, a second, 2, and opened them and said, "Come in," and ended the call. He set the phone down. He looked at the wall above the work table for a moment, and Mira understood she was seeing something private, something that happened in the space between a betrayal being confirmed and the response to it being constructed, and she looked at the documents instead. "He has a daughter," Roman said. "Sen's people found her, used her." A pause. He had no room. Mira thought about room, about the specific geometry of a trap that closed around someone you loved instead of around you. "What do you do with him?" "I don't know yet." His voice had something raw in it that he was keeping controlled. "Right now I get him here and I make sure Sen doesn't know we know." She nodded. "The port window is still live," he said, and she could hear the shift, the transition from the private to the operational, the thing he did when personal grief became tactical fuel. "If we pull the transfer, Sen knows the intercept failed and he goes to ground. We need him where we can see him. So we let him think the transfer is running. We let him come to it," Roman said, "and we're there when he does." She looked at him. You have the evidence, the scanner, the contract, the ledger pages. If the federal contact comes in while I'm at the port, I'll deliver it," she said. "Who's the contact?" He told her. She recognized the name, a federal investigator she'd seen referenced twice in the documents they'd been building over the weeks. A woman named Hargrove, who'd been building a case against Sen's distribution network for 2 years and needed one more connecting thread to get a warrant for his full operation. The Varan shell companies were that thread. The contract on page 37 was the knot that tied it. "She'll want to move on it immediately," Mira said. "She will, which means you need to be out of this building before Sen's people arrive at the port." He looked at her directly. "I need you clear of this location by 9 Saturday morning." Saturday morning was 22 hours away. They looked at each other across the work table. 22 hours. And everything that was still unresolved between them, the contract, the 14 months, the conversation they'd agreed to have when it was over, existed in the background of everything else, present and undeniable and not yet speakable. She said, "I'll be ready." Marco arrived at 4 in the morning. He was a smaller man than Mira remembered, or maybe it was the exhaustion, the particular diminishment of someone who had been carrying something unbearable and had just been found out. He sat across from Roman at the work table, and he didn't look at Mira, and he didn't make excuses, and he didn't cry. He talked. He told them everything, when Sen's people had made contact, what they'd threatened, what he'd given them, and when. The rotation schedule, the transfer window, the gate codes. He laid it out with the flat exhaustion of a man emptying himself because there was nothing left to protect. When he finished, Roman looked at him for a long time. "Your daughter," Roman said. "She's safe," Marco said. "I got her out yesterday. She's with her aunt and—" He stopped. "Away." Roman nodded slowly. "Then you're going to do one more thing for me." Marco looked at him. "You're going to send the confirmation to Sen's contact that the transfer is running as scheduled. Exact window, exact route. No deviation." Roman's voice was flat and final. "And then you're going to stay in this building until it's done." Marco looked at his hands. "And after?" Roman said nothing for a moment. Then, "After, we figure out what after looks like. But I need the Saturday to run clean first." Marco nodded. He sent the message. Roman had Vera take him to a room in the West Wing, and Mira watched him go and thought about the specific arithmetic of desperation, how it turns ordinary people into vectors for disaster, not through malice but through love, pushed past its breaking point. Saturday came faster than 22 hours should allow. Mira was dressed and packed, the scanner in her jacket, the full evidence package that Riel had compiled and encrypted on a drive that Cassius had certified, everything organized with the precision of someone who understood that the quality of the delivery was as important as the content. She came downstairs at 7:15 to find Roman already in the corridor, not in his usual suit but in darker clothing, operational weight to it, a different quality of readiness in the way he was standing. He looked at her for a moment. "Hargrove confirmed the meeting?" she asked. 8:45, the federal building on Marsh Street. "Cassius will take you." "All right." She held the drive. "If this works, when it works," he said. She almost smiled. "When it works, Hargrove can move on Sen's network and the Varan companies simultaneously. Edmund's exposure is complete. The director of record structure collapses because the originating party is under federal indictment." She paused. "My name comes off the filings as part of the immunity arrangement Cassius negotiated." "Yes." "And the consulting contract between your holding company and Edmunds is part of the disclosure package," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "You're going to take damage from that." "Some." He held her gaze. "Less than you took for longer." She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the drive in her hand. "Roman." She looked up. "Be careful at the port." Something in his face moved. "I'm always careful." "That's not what I said." He looked at her for one more moment, and the thing between them, the unresolved, the deferred, the window seat and the contract and everything that existed in the gap between those two facts, was present and acknowledged and not yet resolved. He reached out and put 2 fingers against her jaw, just briefly, the way you touch something you're not sure you'll see again and want to be sure you registered it properly. Then he walked out. The federal building meeting was clean and hard and efficient. Hargrove was a compact woman in her 50s with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been building a case for 2 years and had learned to identify good evidence by the quality of her own response to it. She sat across from Mira in a conference room with Cassius beside her, and she went through the drive in 40 minutes, page by page, not speaking. When she reached the contract, she stopped. She read page 37 twice. "The consulting arrangement," she said, "is documented," Mira said. "His legal exposure is real but secondary. The primary structure is Edmund Varian and Dario Sen. The shell companies are the mechanism. I'm the named director of record, and I'm here telling you that every signature under my name on those filings was either forged or obtained under false pretense." She set the scanner on the table. 400 additional pages from Edmund's personal archive. Original documents, not copies. Hargrove looked at the scanner, then at Mira. "You retrieved these yourself?" "Last Thursday." "From the Varon property?" "Yes." A pause. "Were you authorized to be on that property?" Cassius put a hand on the table. "My client was a resident of that property for 11 years and retains constructive access rights that are documented in the estate records. The retrieval was lawful." Hargrove looked at him for a moment, then back at Mira. "We move on this today," she said. "I need your availability for the next 72 hours. "I'm available," Mira said. She was outside the federal building at 10:14 when her phone rang. The number was one she didn't recognize. She answered it because everything had changed and unknown numbers were no longer things she could leave alone. "Ms. Voss." A man's voice, slightly accented. The particular rhythm she'd heard twice on recordings and once through a floor. Her whole body went cold and then immediately, deliberately still. "Mr. Sen," she said. A pause. "You know my voice. Roman's been thorough." The voice was courteous. That was the worst part of it. "I understand you've had a productive morning." She was already moving down the federal building steps, away from the entrance, phone to her ear, her eyes reading the street. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something before this afternoon. Roman Kael is going to the port tonight because he believes he controls the situation." A pause. "He doesn't." "You're telling me this because I don't want you to be surprised," Sen said. "And because the woman who handed a federal investigator a case file an hour ago is someone I'd prefer to have a conversation with rather than a conflict." A pause. "The port situation is already resolved, Ms. Voss. It resolved itself the moment Roman got in the car this morning. Whatever he thinks he's walking into, he's walking into something else." She stopped walking. She was standing on the sidewalk outside the federal building with the morning moving around her, people and vehicles and the ordinary city, and her heart was doing something she could feel in her molars. "What have you done?" she said. "Nothing irreversible. Yet." A pause. "Come to the Varon house tonight. 8 o'clock. Edmund has agreed to a final conversation. Bring whatever you like. But come alone." His voice was still courteous, still, impossibly, reasonable. "Roman will be held at the port until we're done. That's not a threat to him. It's a courtesy to you. I'd like this to end cleanly. And if I don't come, silence." The specific silence of a man who doesn't need to finish the sentence because the sentence finishes itself. She said, "I'll be there." She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 4 seconds. Then she called Roman. No answer. She called Pike. 2 rings. Then, "Ms. Voss." "Where is Roman?" A pause that was 1 beat too long. "He left for the port at 9:50. We lost his vehicle signal at 10:03. The relay went dark." "Sen has him." Another pause. "We don't know that." "Pike." Her voice was very flat. "Sen just called me. He said the port situation is already resolved. He said Roman will be held until tonight." She turned back toward the federal building, calculating, thinking through the architecture of the next 8 hours. "He doesn't know what I gave Hargrove. He thinks I'm still a variable he can manage. Hargrove can move up the timeline. Not fast enough and not clean enough if Sen has Roman. If she moves on the Varon property with Roman in Sen's custody, Sen burns everything and Roman is the collateral." She was already back inside, already walking toward the elevator. "I need 15 minutes with Cassius, and I need you to find where Sen is holding Roman without letting Sen know you're looking." "Ms. Voss." "I'm going tonight," she said. "Sen's meeting. I'm going, but I'm not walking in there as a variable." She pushed the elevator button. "I'm walking in as the end of it." Cassius took 7 minutes to hear the situation, and 3 minutes to tell her everything he could legally provide, and 2 more to tell her the things he probably shouldn't have. He was a precise man who had been navigating complicated situations for Roman Kael for 8 years, and he looked at Mira across the conference room table with the expression of someone encountering a new variable that he was recalculating in real time. "If you walk into that house tonight with the federal case already filed," he said, "Sen can't touch you without making it catastrophically worse for himself." "I know. He knows that too." "Then he wants something else," Mira said. "He wants the consulting contract buried. He wants the connection between Edmund's holding company and Roman's holding company out of the evidence package. Because if that contract is in the federal case, the investigation expands to Roman's operations, and Sen has been trying to expose Roman's operations for 3 years." She looked at Cassius. "He's not trying to threaten me. He's trying to use me to gut Roman's exposure from the inside. He thinks I'm angry enough about page 37 to do it." Cassius was very still. "Are you?" She thought about page 37. She thought about RK advised on structure. She thought about the window seat and the coffee and the scanner calibrated that morning and 2 fingers against her jaw. She thought about the specific arithmetic of trust when the evidence pointed 2 directions simultaneously. "No," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Then you need to walk into that house tonight with everything, including page 37, and you need to be prepared for Edmund and Sen to use it in the room." "I know. And you need to be prepared for Roman to still be held when you get there." "I know that too." Cassius was quiet. Then he reached into his briefcase and slid a small device across the table. "Body wire," he said. "Hargrove's office. Everything recorded is admissible." He paused. "She agreed to have a team on the perimeter. They go in on your signal or on any indication of physical threat, whichever comes first." Mira picked up the device. It was lighter than she'd expected. She thought about the night she'd stood in Edmund's study and breathed through the tremor in her hands until they steadied. She thought about the woman she'd been in a gray dress with slightly curled fingers and the woman she was now, and the distance between those 2 women was measured not in time but in choices, in the specific gravity of deciding who you were going to be when everything was trying to decide for you. She put the wire in her pocket. She left the federal building at 11:40. She had 8 hours and 20 minutes. She spent 2 of them with Riel going through everything Sen's contact would have passed to him, trying to map what he knew, what he thought he knew, what he was operating on. She spent 1 hour with Pike's updated surveillance reports on the Varon property, exits, sight lines, where Edmund's remaining staff would be. She spent 40 minutes eating because she'd learned from 4 weeks at the estate that the body needed fuel when the mind was running hard, and neither one performed well on empty. She spent the remaining time sitting in the reading room at the estate, on the window seat where she'd watched the city at 6 in the morning and told a man about 11 years of things she'd never said out loud. The city was afternoon bright now, the rain long gone, the water far below catching light. She sat there, and she thought about the sticky note in the desk drawer at her old office. Find a way out. She'd found it. It just hadn't looked like what she'd imagined. At 7:40, she stood up. She checked the wire. She checked the drive. She checked the scanner. She put on the jacket, and she looked out the window at the city that had been operating in her name for 19 months, and she thought clearly and completely about what was waiting for her in the obsidian-walled drawing room of the Varon house. Edmund, Celeste, Dario Sen, the full weight of everything they'd built on her name. And somewhere, in a situation she didn't fully know yet, Roman. She thought about his face when she'd said, "Be careful," the way he'd looked at her before he walked out. She thought about what she was willing to do and what she wasn't, and where the line between justice and revenge actually ran when you were standing this close to it. She went downstairs. Pike was by the door. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him. "Is there any word on Roman?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Not yet." She breathed in, breathed out. "Then we go," she said. "And we finish this." The car pulled out of the estate gates and started down toward the city. The port was somewhere to the south, dark and specific, holding something she couldn't get to yet. The Varon house was ahead, lit from inside, the windows warm and false in the evening. She rode toward it in the back seat with her hands flat on her thighs and her heart doing what hearts do when the body understands the stakes more completely than the mind wants to. and she looked at the city through the window. Her city. Her name all over it in ways she hadn't chosen, and she thought, not for much longer. The car turned into the Varan Street. The front door was open, light spilling out onto the stone steps. Edmund standing in the frame of it, watching the car arrive, his face in partial shadow and his hands in his pockets, and beside him, barely visible, Celeste. And behind them both, deeper in the house, a figure Mira recognized even through the lit window, even at distance, even before she could see his face fully. The car stopped. She opened the door. She got out. Roman was inside. Standing in the Varan drawing room with two of Sen's men flanking him, his jacket gone, his hands not bound, but his posture carrying the specific tension of a man held in place by the geometry of threat rather than physical restraint. A cut above his left eye had dried dark. His face was its most stripped down, all the usual layers gone, and when he saw her come through the door, it moved through him. Something that tried to be relief and hit anger instead, because relief in this situation was a liability. "I told Pike not to let you," he started. "Pike works for you," she said. "I made my own decision." He looked at her. The cut. The two men. The room. Edmund stepped forward. "Mira." His voice had its usual precision and its usual careful distance, but underneath it something was showing that she'd never heard in 11 years. A thinness. The specific strain of a man whose structure is already coming down and who knows it and hasn't yet accepted it. "You've been busy." "I have," she said. Celeste was by the fireplace. She looked at Mira with an expression that had none of the performance of the ballroom. No calculated pity, no performed warmth, just the naked face of someone who had run out of masks. She looked, Mira thought, like a person. Maybe for the first time. Sen came in from the side corridor. He looked the way voices with that rhythm tended to look. Deliberate, contained, wearing courtesy the way a blade wears a sheath. "Ms. Voss," he said. "Thank you for coming." She looked at him. She looked at Roman. She looked at the room, the drawing room of the Varan house, the room she'd moved through for 11 years, the room she'd cleaned out of instinct and habit and the learned architecture of invisibility. She reached into her jacket and placed the drive on the mantel. The room went very still. "Everything is already filed," she said. 400 pages of original documents from this house's archive. Edmund's ledgers, the shell company registrations, the transaction records, the consulting contract. She held Sen's gaze. "Including the pages that show your fingerprints in the transfer timing, including the communication records Pike's team intercepted regarding the port window." She paused. "Including the name of the inside contact and the coercion your people used to recruit him." Sen looked at her without moving. "Hargrove's team is on the perimeter," she said. "She goes in on my signal or on any indication of threat to anyone in this room." She looked at Edmund. "The immunity arrangement is conditional on full cooperation. It covers me and one other named party. Cassius filed the conditional offer at 4 o'clock this afternoon." Edmund looked at the drive on the mantel. His face had gone the specific gray of a man watching 11 years of construction become evidence. "The other named party," Edmund said slowly, "is not you," she said. Celeste made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was something older than words, the sound a person makes when the last possible version of the future closes. Roman was still watching Mira. His face had moved past the anger, past the relief, and was doing something she'd seen once before, the deep, almost visible thing, the one that lived behind the stillness. He was watching her the way he'd watched her in the ballroom, except that what he'd seen then was potential, and what he was seeing now was the thing itself, fully arrived. Standing in the room that made her and holding the evidence that would end it, and giving him the look of a woman who had made every choice herself and was not done yet. One of Sen's men moved, and everything happened at once. The man reached for Roman, not a weapon, a grip, repositioning, the specific motion of someone being signaled to move a hostage. And Roman moved first, the way people who have been trained move, not away from the threat, but through it. One sharp motion that put the man's arm at an angle it wasn't designed for, and put the man on the floor. The second man came forward, and Mira was already moving, already across the room. And she did something she hadn't planned and hadn't thought through and would think about afterward for a long time. She got between the second man and Roman, not because it was strategic, not because Cassius or Roman or any training had told her to, but because her body made the decision before her mind finished the sentence. The second man stopped. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and her face was doing something she'd never felt her face do before. Not the careful stillness of the gala, not the compressed stillness of the Varon house, but an absolute open certainty. The face of a woman who has run out of things to lose and discovered that losing them was the most clarifying thing that ever happened to her. He took a step back. Sen said, "Enough." The room held. Roman's hand found Mira's arm. His grip was tight, and she felt the shake in it. Not fear, exhaustion, the specific physical cost of a man who'd been held and handled for 6 hours and was running on something past his reserves. She steadied herself against it. "Signal Hargrove," Roman said quietly. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the device. Edmund was standing very still by the fireplace. Celeste had not moved. Sen was looking at the drive on the mantel with the expression of a man calculating the distance between what he'd planned and where he was standing and finding the number insurmountable. Mira pressed the signal. Outside, she heard the cars. Inside, she held Roman's arm and felt his pulse against her fingers, fast and real, and she looked at the room, at Edmund and Celeste and the drive on the mantel and the 2 men on the floor and Sen standing in the center of it all, and she thought, this is where it ends. The front door opened. Hargrove came through it with 4 agents behind her and the specific energy of a woman who had been building toward this room for 2 years and had arrived at it with everything she needed. And she looked at Sen first because Sen was the primary and said, in a voice with no performance in it whatsoever, "Dario Sen, federal warrant, don't!" Sen didn't move. That was the thing Mira would remember afterward. Not the agents coming through the door, not the sound of Edmund's breath catching, not Celeste pressing herself back against the fireplace like the wall might absorb her. She would remember Sen standing in the center of the Varon drawing room and not moving, and the quality of his stillness being entirely different from Roman's stillness, entirely different from hers. Roman's stillness was density, presence, the stillness of something with weight. Sen's was the stillness of a man watching the architecture of 3 years collapse in real time and calculating to the very last second whether there was a move left. There wasn't. Hargrove came through the door and her 4 agents spread through the room with the practiced efficiency of people who had rehearsed this specific geometry, and Sen looked at the drive on the mantel, and then at Mira, and then at Roman's hand on her arm, and something moved across his face, not surprise, not anger. Something closer to acknowledgement. The specific expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it, and has enough pride to recognize the quality of the work. He put his hands up. His 2 men followed. The one Roman had put on the floor got up slowly, holding his arm, and Mira watched him do it and felt nothing except the specific, clean absence of fear. The thing that's left when fear has burned completely through and you're standing on the other side of it. Hargrove moved to Sen and her agent moved to Edmund. Edmund didn't resist. He stood very straight and very still while his hands were secured and his face had gone entirely to gray, and the 11 years of careful construction were coming apart around him in a drawing room that smelled of lemon polish and old wood, and Mira looked at him and waited for something. Rage, satisfaction, grief, the specific catharsis she'd imagined in the abstract on bad nights in the Varon house. None of it came. What came instead was something quieter, something that felt less like victory and more like the ending of a long weather system. The eye passing, the air going still. "Celeste." Hargrove's second agent moved toward her and Celeste said, "Don't," in a voice stripped of every performance mechanism she'd ever used, a voice Mira had never heard from her before. Not the ballroom voice, not the calculated warmth, not the surgical precision, just a woman's voice, frightened and small and real. She looked at the agent and she looked at her father being walked toward the door and she looked at Mira. The look lasted a long time. Mira held it. There were things available to be said. 11 years of things, cataloged and stored in the specific way that people who've been hurt quietly and consistently store things, not with drama, but with the precision of someone who had nothing else to do with the pain except keep it organized. She could have said any of them. She didn't say any of them. Because Celeste's face, stripped of its performance, was the face of someone who had built her entire identity on a superiority that had just been revealed as the thing it always was. A structure with nothing real underneath. A performance in an empty theater. That was already its own sentence. Mira didn't need to add to it. She turned away. Roman was still beside her. His grip on her arm had loosened, but his hand was still there, and she was still aware of his pulse, still fast, still the physical reality of a man who had been held for 6 hours and run on reserves for the last 2. The cut above his eye had opened slightly in the movement. She looked at it and then looked at him. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not." She looked at him steadily. "Sit down." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being told what to do and had just decided consciously and completely to do it anyway. He sat on the arm of the nearest chair. She found a cloth on the side table, one of Edmund's precisely folded decorative things, and pressed it to the cut, and he let her, which told her more about the 6 hours than anything he would have said. Hargrove came to her after Edmund and Sen had been walked out. She looked at Roman briefly, assessed the situation, looked at Mira. "The conditional immunity," she said. "Yes." "The second name party." Hargrove's eyes moved to Roman. "Kyle Strategic Holdings. The consulting contract." "The contract is in the package," Mira said. "The consulting arrangement created secondary liability. Roman Kyle is cooperating fully and has provided material evidence that expands the federal case against Sen's distribution network by a factor you'll understand when you read the full file." She held Hargrove's gaze. "The immunity is conditional on full disclosure, which has been provided." Cassius filed the terms. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. The look of a woman doing a calculation she'd already done 3 times and was doing once more to be certain. "You're protecting him," she said. "Not accusatory, observational." "I'm providing accurate legal context," Mira said. "There's a difference." Hargrove almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but it was close. "I'll need you both in my office Monday morning." "We'll be there," Mira said. Hargrove left. The agents left. The Varon house went quiet, in the specific way that rooms go quiet, when the thing that was always going to happen has finally happened and the air has nothing left to hold. Mira stood in the drawing room of the house she'd lived in for 11 years and looked at the mantel and the drive that was no longer there. Hargrove had taken it, and the empty space where it had sat, and she thought about the 11 years that had happened in the rooms above and around her. Edmund's deliberate blindness, Celeste's first smile with nothing warm in it, the forms on a Tuesday, the sticky note. Roman came up beside her. He'd gotten to his feet without announcing it, which was simply how he moved, and he stood beside her and looked at the mantel too. "She'll hold the terms," he said. Hargrove. "I know. My exposure is manageable," she said. Cassius spent 2 days making sure of it. She paused. "You're going to take some damage from the contract disclosure. Your holding company will be under review for 6 months. 2 of your port contracts will be suspended pending the investigation scope review." "I know." "You knew before tonight." "Yes." She looked at him. "Then why didn't you put the contract out of the package yourself? You had access to Cassius. You had access to the evidence file before I did." He looked at her with an expression that had the quality of something that had been prepared and set aside and was now simply true. "Because it was yours," he said. "The package, the filing, the decision about what went in it. All of it. I built the thing that put your name on those filings, and you built the thing that got your name off them. That belongs to you completely, including the parts that cost me something." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about page 37. She thought about what it had done to her in that study, standing over Edmund's desk with her hands vibrating and the archive files open. She thought about the conversation in the study afterward. Both of those things are true, and the specific quality of his voice when he said it, the absence of deflection. She thought about what it meant to be looked at directly when the truth was difficult and to have the person across from you not look away. "We still need to have the other conversation," she said. "I know. The 14 months, all of it." "Yes." He looked at her. "Not tonight." "Not tonight," she agreed. He put his hand over hers on the mantel. Not a grip, just a hand. She looked at it and then looked at the empty room and she thought, This is what it feels like when something ends and something else hasn't started yet, and the space between them is just that, space, not absence. She turned off the drawing room light on her way out. The legal process that followed was not clean and was not fast, and was not the kind of thing that resolved in a single dramatic moment, the way stories sometimes pretend it does. It was paperwork and depositions and conference rooms with fluorescent lighting and Cassius in his precise suits saying precise things while Hargrove's team worked through the evidence file layer by layer. It was Monday morning at the federal building, and Tuesday, and the following Monday, and the one after that. It was Edmund's attorney filing motions that Cassius responded to with the quiet efficiency of someone who had better material. It was Sen's legal team attempting 3 separate approaches to suppress the intercepted communications and failing each time because Pike's surveillance methodology had been clean and Cassius had made sure of it. It was, in its own way, another kind of fight. Slower, procedural, without the physical reality of the port or the drawing room, but no less consequential. Mira sat in those conference rooms and gave her depositions and answered questions about the forms she'd signed and the companies she'd never managed, and the name that had been used without her knowledge, and she did it with the same precision she'd brought to the financial structures and the ledger pages, clearly, completely, without drama. Edmund pleaded on the 43rd day. His attorney negotiated the terms. Edmund Varon, who had stood by windows and chosen deliberate blindness for 11 years, who had handed his stepdaughter a stack of forms on a Tuesday and signed her name into a trap, received 7 years and the forfeiture of the assets built on the shell company structure. The Varon house went into receivership. Edmund's board positions dissolved. The lawyer who drafted the filings received 18 months and a permanent bar. Celeste was not indicted. This was Mira's decision. Cassius had outlined the exposure and the evidence and the potential charges, and Mira had listened to all of it and then said, "She knew, but knowing and doing are different things, and I'm not interested in pursuing someone for the lesser crime when the greater crime is already prosecuted." Cassius had looked at her for a moment, and then written down what she'd said and filed the conditional exclusion. She didn't tell Roman this decision until after it was filed. He looked at her when she told him. Something moved in his face. "She humiliated you in a room full of 500 people," he said. "I know." "She made contact with Sen. She gave him the routing information." "I know." Sen's charges include the coercion of that contact and the routing disclosure. She looked at Roman. Celeste was desperate, and she made a terrible choice, and her father is going to prison, and she has nothing left. That's already more consequence than she knows how to carry. She paused. "I'm not interested in adding to it." He looked at her for a long time. "You're a harder woman than you look," he said. "I know," she said. "I always was." Nobody bothered to check. Sen's trial took 11 months. The evidence package held. The port operation exposure, the shell company connection, the intercepted communications, the testimony from the inside contact, Marco, who cooperated fully and received a suspended sentence in recognition of the coercion his family had been subjected to. It all held, and it held cleanly, and on the 312th day after the night in the Varon drawing room, Dario Sen was convicted on 11 counts and sentenced to 22 years. Mira was in the courthouse when the verdict was read. She was sitting in the gallery 3 rows back, and when the verdict came, she didn't cry and didn't react with visible satisfaction. She sat quietly for a moment while the room around her moved and reacted, and she thought about Roman's estate and the scanner and the sticky note in the desk drawer and 11 years of learning to be invisible, and she thought that invisible things sometimes survive precisely because they're underestimated, and that the underestimation of someone is often the most expensive mistake the underestimator ever makes. Then she stood up and walked out into a city that no longer had her name attached to anything she hadn't chosen. In the 2 years that followed, she built something. She had the idea in the 3rd month of the legal process, sitting in a conference room waiting for a deposition to resume, thinking about the financial structure that had been used against her, the shell companies, the forged signatures, the exploitation of her professional credentials. She thought about how the mechanism worked, and she thought about how many people it could work on. And she thought about women specifically, women in financial dependency situations, women in family structures that controlled their identities and their signatures and their names, and she thought, someone should make this harder to do to people. She talked to Cassius about it. She talked to Rael, who had connections in the financial forensics world and understood the regulatory landscape. She talked to a woman named Dr. Farron, who ran a victim advocacy organization and had spent 15 years watching financial abuse slide under the legal radar because it didn't leave visible marks. She talked to people who knew things she didn't, and she listened to them, and she built the thing. The Mirrored Phoenix Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing financial literacy, legal advocacy, and crisis intervention for women experiencing financial abuse, family-controlled identity fraud, and economically coerced legal entrapment. It launched 18 months after the verdict with 3 staff members and a single office above a law firm in the financial district. Within 8 months, it had 12 staff and a waiting list. Within a year, it had federal funding and 2 satellite offices and a pro bono legal partnership with 4 of the city's largest firms. Mira ran it with the same precision she'd brought to everything else. Thoroughly, without performance, paying close attention to the details that mattered, and delegating the details that didn't, and always being available in person. When a woman sat across a desk from her and described the specific architecture of a trap, she didn't know she was in until it was already built. She was good at it. She was good at it because she understood the trap from the inside, because she'd lived in the house while the house was being used against her, because she knew what it felt like to sign forms on a Tuesday and think nothing more of it because she'd been trained not to ask questions. She could look at a document and find the thing in it that was wrong before the woman across from her had finished explaining. She could sit in a room with someone who had spent years learning to be invisible and say, without performing it, without the pity that was its own kind of violence, "I see you." That isn't something you learn, it's something you survive into. The night of the Foundation's 2nd anniversary gala was in October, 2 years and 3 weeks after the night she'd stood in a gray dress against the wall of the Aurelio's Hotel ballroom and held a water glass with slightly curled fingers while a room laughed. The venue was the Aurelio's Hotel. She'd booked it specifically. The ballroom had been redressed. Her team had done it. Clean white linens and low floral arrangements and lighting that was warmer than the original, less like a stage and more like a room. 500 people, roughly the same number as the charity gala, but the composition was entirely different. Women who'd used the Foundation's services and were now 3 years on the other side. Legal advocates, financial professionals, 3 federal judges, 2 senators, Riel in a green dress, laughing at something with Dr. Farron. Cassius, precise as always, with a glass of sparkling water and the expression of a man who had seen many things and was quietly satisfied with how this particular thing had turned out. Pike, near the door, in a suit that didn't quite fit the way suits should, but that he wore with the same solid competence he brought to everything. Mira spoke for 12 minutes. She didn't use notes. She told the truth about the Foundation's work in specific, concrete terms, numbers, cases, outcomes. She said the word financial abuse clearly and several times, because one of the first things she'd learned was that naming things specifically was the beginning of dismantling them. She said, "The most sophisticated trap is the one that uses your own credentials against you." She said, "Being unseen is sometimes a survival mechanism and sometimes a cage, and the work of this foundation is helping women understand the difference." She said, "I know what it is to be in a room where people are laughing at you. I also know what it is to stop caring about the laughter. The second one takes longer, but it lasts." When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, and then it was not quiet at all. She stepped back from the podium. She accepted the handshakes and the brief, fierce embraces of women she'd sat across desks from, and she was present for each one, not managing them, not performing warmth, just there, the way she'd learned to be there with Roman on the window seat at 6 in the morning when being present was its own form of language. She found him at the top of the staircase. He was standing where the stairs curved toward the mezzanine, slightly apart from the room below, watching. He was in a dark suit. The scar on his jaw caught the light the way it always did, barely visible unless you knew to look. His eyes found her as she came up the stairs, and they stayed on her the way they'd stayed on her in the ballroom 2 years ago. The first time, the same attention, the same quality of being looked at fully. He had not been in her life continuously in those 2 years. That was the truth of it, and she'd needed the truth of it to be true. The conversation they'd agreed to have, we'll say, the one about 14 months and page 37 and the specific arithmetic of trust when the evidence pointed in 2 directions, had happened, and it had not been clean, and it had not been brief, and at one point she'd walked out of the room and stood in the corridor for 4 minutes before going back in. And it had required the kind of honesty that left marks on both sides. It had required her to say, I don't know if I can fully forgive something and fully trust someone who did it simultaneously. And it had required him to say, I know. I'm not asking you to do both at once. I'm asking you to tell me when you figure out what you can do. So she told him, not immediately. Over months, in the incremental way that real things develop, not in dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of ordinary moments, phone calls, one dinner, two others, a conversation that went until 3 in the morning and ended in the specific silence of two people who have said everything they needed to say and discovered there's still something on the other side of it. She'd told him in February, 8 months after the trial, on a night when the city was cold and the estate was warm, and she was sitting in the reading room on the window seat, and he'd come in and sat across from her, and she'd looked at him and said, I trust you. Not completely. Not without the knowing what I know. But enough to move forward on, which is what trust actually is when you're paying attention. He'd looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd said, That's more than I expected and exactly what I needed to hear. Now he watched her come up the stairs, and she watched him watch her, and the 2 years were in the air between them, along with everything that had happened inside them. The months of distance and the months of careful, deliberate reconstruction, the foundation, and the verdict, and the depositions, and the window seat, and all the coffee cups, and the scanner, and the gala 2 years ago, and the document on the table in his hand, briefly, on her shoulder, there and then gone. She stopped beside him on the landing. Below them, the room moved and glittered, and the string quartet played, and 500 people stood in the ballroom of the Aurelio's Hotel, and none of them were laughing at the wrong things. Good speech, Roman said. It was 12 minutes. 12 good minutes. She looked at the room below. Edmund applied for early release last month. I know. It was denied. I know that too. He looked at her. Does it matter to you? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd trained herself to think about things, without the overlay of what she was supposed to feel, without the performance of emotion in either direction. Less than I thought it would, she said. He's not the primary thing anymore. He hasn't been for a while. What's the primary thing? She gestured at the room below. That, she said, what that is and what it's going to be. He nodded slowly. He looked at the room for a moment, and she looked at his profile, the jaw and the scar and the dark eyes and the suit without a single unnecessary thing about it. And she thought about the man she'd understood him to be before she knew him, and the man she'd discovered him to be while knowing him in the distance between those two versions, which was real and significant and navigable. Roman, she said. He turned to look at her. The port contracts, she said, the 2 that were suspended. Reinstated 3 months ago. I know, I read the filing. She paused. Your holding company review. Closed, clean. I know that too. She looked at him. I keep track. Something in his face moved. I know you do. She looked at him for a moment, at the way the light from the ballroom below caught the angles of his face, at the cut above his eye that had long since healed and left nothing visible, at the man who had crossed a ballroom and made a declaration and laid a document on a table and sat across from her on a window seat and told the truth even when the truth was costly. Dance with me, she said. He looked at her. Something in the dark eyes shifted. Not surprise, not quite, but the specific response of a man who had been carrying a weight for 2 years and has just been offered a different way to hold it. He offered his hand. Not the same as the ballroom. The ballroom had been rescue, protection, a declaration aimed outward at a room that needed to hear it. This was different. This was 2 people standing at the top of a staircase after everything, offering something to each other that had nothing to do with the room below and everything to do with the 2 of them, here, now, in possession of all the relevant facts. She took his hand. They went down the stairs. The room didn't stop when they reached the floor. It didn't part the way it had 2 years ago, didn't reconfigure itself around his presence. They simply walked onto the floor, and the music was there, and other people were there, and the chandeliers threw light in every direction, and Mira Voss, who had stood in this room in a gray dress with slightly curled fingers and learned what it felt like to be laughed at, and learned what it felt like to stop caring, and built something on the other side of both those things. Put her hand in Roman Kael's hand, and her hand on his shoulder, and they moved. Not perfectly. He was not a natural dancer, and she hadn't done this in years, and they found the rhythm together the way you find most things together, by doing it, by making the small adjustments, by being present to the other person's particular way of moving and matching it without losing your own. Mira looked at the room while they danced. She saw Riel laughing. She saw Cassius in conversation with one of the senators. She saw Pike by the door, still in the suit that didn't quite fit, scanning the perimeter out of pure professional habit. And when he caught her eye, he gave her a nod that had something warm in it she'd never have expected from him 2 years ago. She saw Dr. Farron with 3 women from the Foundation's first cohort, and the way the 3 women were standing, not against the wall, not compressed into the architecture, but in the center of the room, taking up exactly the space they were owed. She looked at Roman. He was looking at her. "You're not afraid of anything in this room," he said. "No," she said. "That's different." "Yes," she said. "It is." They danced through the end of one song and into the beginning of another, and the chandeliers threw their light, and the city was outside the windows doing what the city always did, moving, building, being itself. And Mira thought about the drawer in the desk at her old office, and the sticky note that said, "Find a way out," and she thought that she'd found it, finally, and that it hadn't looked like escape at all. It looked like this. It looked like standing in the center of the room that had once laughed at you and holding the hand of a man who saw you clearly, including the parts that were difficult to see, and feeling for the first time in a life that had spent a long time teaching her not to feel it, entirely and completely, and without performance or apology, like herself. The music played on. The room held them both. And Mira Voss, who had once been called ugly in a voice designed to wound and had survived it and built something on the other side of it that was more real than anything that voice had ever touched, closed her eyes for a single measure and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into its right place. Not gone, not forgotten, not resolved into something painless, but carried properly, carried in the way that strong things carry hard things, with full knowledge of the weight and the specific, hard-won knowledge that she was equal to it. She opened her eyes. The chandeliers blazed. She danced.